They laughed as the Duke's family raised their glasses to the fortune of the house, and not one of them knew that the plain, grey-eyed woman seated at the far end of the table held, folded in the little portfolio upon her lap, the deed to the very ground beneath their gilded chairs. They drank to Ravensmere as though it were theirs by right of blood and pride, and she watched them do it. And she said nothing, and her stillness was the only true thing in that bright and brittle room. It was the dead heart of winter, and Ravensmere had dressed itself for triumph. The great drawing-room of the Duke's estate blazed with light, for the Dowager had ordered beeswax tapers by the 100 rather than the cheaper tallow, and they burned in tall silver branches down the whole length of the long table, throwing their warm and trembling gold across damask and crystal and the polished faces of the family silver. Frost had laced itself across the tall windows in ferns and feathers, so that the black winter night beyond was shut away behind a veil of white tracery, and within, all was heat and glitter, and the low rich murmur of people who had never in their lives been cold by accident. Above the great stone hearth, carved deep into the mantel and gilded so that it caught the firelight and held it, hung the ducal arms, the raven and the tower, the motto beneath in letters worn smooth by 2 centuries of polishing hands. The fire roared in the grate beneath it. The gilt picked out 100 small suns along the cornices and the picture frames and the rims of the wine glasses, and the whole room seemed to breathe wealth the way other rooms breathe air, easily, without thought, as a thing simply owed. At the head of the table, beneath the carved raven, sat the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmere. She was a woman past 60 who had refused, with the cold determination of a general, to surrender a single inch to her years. Her gown was the deep wine-dark crimson of old money, her hair dressed high and powdered pale, and at her throat hung the famous Ravensmere rubies, 3 of them, large as a child's thumbnail, that had come into the family in the reign of the 2nd George. She sat very straight. She did not laugh easily, but when she did, it was a small, precise, downward laugh, a laugh that fell upon its object like a blade laid flat, and the whole table had learned over many years to laugh when she laughed, in the same key, at the same moment, at the same person. She was the true mistress of that house, and everyone at the table knew it. And the chief pleasure of her old age was that everyone knew it. To her right sat the rest of them, ranged in order of their nearness to her favour. There was the Duke's heir, his nephew Alistair, a handsome, restless young man of 27, with a weak and pleasant mouth and eyes that went always to whichever face in the room was laughing loudest, that he might laugh with it. There was a scattering of cousins and connections, the lesser planets of that small, bright system, all of them dressed beyond their means, and all of them watchful. And there, glittering, was Lady Vespera. Lady Vespera was the Dowager's grandniece, and she had been raised from the cradle to understand that Ravensmere ought, by every law of beauty and breeding, to be hers. She was 24 and lovely in the cold, flawless, expensive way that men write verses about and women do not trust. That night she wore pale ice blue silk and diamonds in her dark hair, and she sat near to Alistair, and she leaned toward him when he spoke and laughed before he had finished his small jests, and every now and again her glance travelled the length of the table to the far end, to the plain woman seated below the salt, and something moved behind her lovely eyes that was not quite hatred only, because hatred would have paid the plain woman too much honour. Lady Vespera coveted the match. She coveted Alistair, who would one day be Duke. She coveted the rubies, she coveted the raven and the tower and the long gilded room. And between her and all of it stood only one obstacle, and the obstacle was sitting, at that moment, very quietly, eating very little, at the far cold end of the table, where the candles were fewer and burned lower. Her name was Eleanor Holloway, and she was the bride. She was 29, which the family said behind their fans was old, and she was plain, which the family said to her face in 100 small ways every hour of the day. Her face was long and grave and even, with a wide, steady mouth and a pair of clear grey eyes that did not flinch and did not water and did not, whatever was said, look away. Her hair was brown, neither dark nor fair, dressed simply and without ornament. She wore that night a gown of dove grey, of good plain stuff, beautifully kept and beautifully made, but 2 seasons out of the fashion, and entirely without jewels. And amid all that crimson and ice blue and diamond fire she sat like a single quiet word of prose set down in the middle of a page of gilded verse. Her hands were still. That was the first thing a careful watcher might have noticed about Eleanor Holloway, that her hands, alone in all that restless, glittering company, were perfectly still. One of them rested upon a small, flat portfolio of worn brown leather that she had carried into the room upon her arm and laid across her lap, and that she had not, the whole evening, set aside. She was seated below the salt. Now, there are old customs in old houses, and this is one of them, and it is worth the pausing over, for the whole cruelty of that evening turned upon it. In the great halls of England, time out of mind, there had stood upon the dining table a single grand salt cellar, a piece of wrought silver, often very fine. Set down at the table's centre as a kind of boundary stone, those of rank and welcome, the family and its honoured guests, sat above the salt, nearest the head, in the warmth and the strong light. Those of lesser consequence, the poor relation, the hired man, the tutor, the tradesman, the guest one was obliged to feed, but did not care to flatter, sat below the salt, down at the cold foot of the table, in the thinning candlelight, where the dishes came last and half emptied, and the conversation did not trouble to travel. To be seated below the salt was to be told, without a single word being spoken, exactly what you were worth. It was an insult a servant could read at a glance. It was an insult the lowest scullery maid carrying in the soup could see and carry back to the kitchen to be laughed over. And the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmere, who did nothing by accident, had with her own hand directed that Eleanor Holloway, the affianced bride of the heir, the future of the house, be seated that night below the salt. The great silver cellar stood there at the table's middle like a small fortress, gleaming, and on the near side of it sat the Duke's family in their crimson and their diamonds, and on the far side, alone in the dimmer light, sat the bride, with her still hands and her plain grey gown and her worn brown portfolio, and everyone in that room understood the message, and everyone in that room, save one, was pleased by it, for Eleanor had not been chosen. She had been arranged. The thing had been done over her head and around her, in the manner of such things, by men talking in low voices about money, though she had not, that winter, yet understood quite how much money, nor quite whose. Her father, lately dead, had been a man of the city, a banker, a man of careful sums and quiet ledgers, a man of trade, and to the Ravensmeres the word trade was the foulest in the language, and they had spoken it across the dinner table that very evening twice already, glancing toward her each time to be sure the dart had carried. A merchant's daughter. New money. Common blood, a plain face and a flat voice, and no family worth the naming. That she was here at all, that she was to marry Alastair, that her name was to be joined to the Raven and the Tower. This was, to the Dowager, a kind of wound that must be daily cauterized with contempt, lest it be mistaken for a thing accepted. And so they came, that night, to the toasting. It was the Duke himself who should have risen first, for it was his house and his nephew and his guest. And for a moment it seemed that he might. He sat at the foot of his own pride, the Duke of Ravensmere, a tall, stooped, courteous man of 60, with a kind and weary and frightened face, and he turned his wine-glass slowly by the stem and looked down the length of his own gleaming table to where the plain young woman sat below the salt, and something crossed his face, some old half-buried decency, some flicker of shame. He was not a cruel man. That was the worst that could be said of him, and the truest. He was not cruel. Only weak, only tired, only long ago broken to the dowager's hand as a horse is broken, until obedience had worn the very shape of his soul. He saw the insult of the salt. He had seen it when he entered the room. And he had said nothing, because to say something would have been to cross his mother. And he had not crossed his mother in 40 years, and the muscles that might have done it had wasted to nothing. He looked at Eleanor. She felt the look and raised her grey eyes and met it, steadily, without reproach. And it was the Duke who looked away. He found the surface of his wine very interesting. He did not rise. It was the dowager who rose. She rose without haste, as the great rise, knowing the room would still itself around her, and it did. The laughter thinned and stopped. The cousins set down their forks. Lady Vespera turned her lovely face up like a flower to the light. The dowager lifted her glass, and the rubies burned at her throat, and the candlelight ran down the crystal, and the wine glowed within it like something living. And she let the silence ripen one beat longer than was comfortable, which was an art she had perfected over 50 years. "My friends," she said, and her voice was low and clear and carried to every corner without effort, "we are gathered to a happy purpose. A betrothal. A joining. A small pause. A small downward smile. I will not pretend to you, for we are family. And among family one does not pretend that this house has not weathered its weathers, as all great houses do. There have been lean seasons. There have been, shall we say, accommodations. A ripple of knowing, indulgent laughter ran along the upper table. The cousins who knew the family had been quietly short of money for 30 years, laughed at the elegance of the word. But the raven endures, said the dowager, as the raven has always endured. The tower stands, and tonight I ask you to raise your glasses to the fortune of the House of Ravensmere, to all that we hold. She turned her head then, slowly, deliberately, down the length of the table, past the great salt cellar, into the dimmer light, until her cold, pale eyes came to rest upon Eleanor Holloway. "And let us be generous," she said sweetly, "as the great should always be generous to the small. Let us drink, too, to our guest from the world of commerce, who comes to us with such a very useful dowry, and so very plain a face, that we need none of us fear she married my nephew for his looks." The laughter broke then, all together, in the same key, falling where she had aimed it. Alistair laughed, looking to Vespera to be sure he laughed correctly. Vespera laughed, a bright silver peal, her diamonds shaking. The cousins laughed. The footmen along the wall kept their faces of stone, but the message would be in the kitchen within the quarter hour. Up and down the bright, crowded side of the table they laughed, the Duke's proud family. Drinking deep to the fortune of the house, to all that they held, mocking the plain bride seated below the salt, her face, her father's trade, her common blood, her silence. And below the salt, in the thinning candlelight, Eleanor Holloway did not flush, and did not tremble, and did not drop her eyes. Her right hand lay quiet upon the worn brown portfolio in her lap, and beneath the worn brown leather lay paper, and upon the paper lay ink, and the ink had been set down years ago by a careful man in a quiet office in the city, and it said, though not one soul in that bright and laughing room yet knew it, that the ground they sat upon, the hearth they warmed at, the Raven and the tower and the long gilded room and the very chairs of polished oak in which they sat to mock her were, by the plain cold faultless letter of the law of England, hers. She let the laughter run its course. She let it crest and fall and trail into the satisfied silence that follows shared cruelty. And then, when it was quiet, when every face had turned at last toward the foot of the table to see whether the plain merchant's daughter would weep, or stammer, or flee, Elinor lifted her own glass, slowly, and looked up the long bright table at the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmere with her steady grey eyes, and she smiled. It was a small smile, and a calm one, and there was nothing of fear in it, and nothing of malice either, only a great and settled certainty, the certainty of one who has read to the end of a book that everyone else in the room believes themselves to be still writing. "To all that you hold," she said quietly, and drank. "Yes, by all means. Let us drink to that." And something in the unhurried way she said it, in the perfect ease of her plain, grave face, made the laughter die in Lady Vespera's throat, and made the dowager's cold eyes narrow the smallest fraction, and made the weak, kind, frightened Duke look up sharply from his wine, as though, far off, beneath the frost and the candlelight and the warm familiar certainties of 100 years. Some of them had heard, for the first time, the faint cold sound of a floor that was not, after all, quite so solid as they had always believed. She heard it too, that faint cold sound, though she alone in the room had known it was coming, for she had carried it into the house herself, folded in worn brown leather across her arm. And as the feast wore on toward its weary end, as the cousins grew loud with wine, and the dowager's wit grew crueler, and the great candles burned down in their silver branches and guttered, Elinor Holloway sat with her still hands and her quiet smile, and let her mind go back, as it had gone back so many times that winter, to the long, slow road that had brought her to that cold foot of that bright table, and to the things she carried, and to why, holding it, she had said nothing at all. For the truth of Ravensmere, the truth beneath the gilt and the rubies and the 2 centuries of polished pride, was a truth of money, and it was older than Elinor and older than Alistair, and very nearly as old as the dowager's own iron will. The great houses of England did not, for the most part, sit upon mountains of gold, they sat upon land, and land was wealth only so long as it was kept. And keeping it cost more with every passing year, the roofs, the rents fallen behind, the servants, the horses, the 100 small magnificences that a duke could not be seen to do without. And so, as great houses had done time out of mind, the Ravensmeres had borrowed. 30 years before, in the Duke's own younger and more reckless day, when the rents had failed 3 seasons together, and the old Duke's debts had come due all at once like crows to a fallen thing, the family had gone quietly to the city, to the very world of commerce the dowager spat upon across her dinner table, and they had raised a great sum of money upon the security of the estate itself. They had mortgaged Ravensmere. They had pledged the Raven and the Tower and the long gilded room and every acre of the park and the home farm and the village beyond it, pledged the whole of it as surety against a loan they had spent and never wholly repaid, and they had signed their pride away in ink upon a bond. And then they had come home and lit their beeswax candles and gone on as though nothing in the world had changed. The man who had lent them that money, who had drawn up the bond with such care, and held it, and renewed it, and never once pressed them harshly though the law would have let him, was a banker of the city named Josiah Holloway. He was Elinor's father. He had been, by every account but his daughter's, exactly the sort of man the Ravensmeres despised, low-born, self-made. A tradesman's son who had risen by his own careful arithmetic to be one of the quiet powers of the city. A man whose name on a note was worth more than a lord's word, and who knew it. The dowager had taken his money and loathed the taking of it. She had used his gold to gild her ceilings and had never once, in 30 years, suffered his name to be spoken in her drawing-room without a curl of the lip. But Josiah Holloway had not been the grasping creature she imagined. He had been a careful man, and a proud one in his own quiet fashion, and a just one, and he had held the bond on Ravensmere all those years, not to ruin a duke, but because a thing lent ought one day to be a thing returned. And he had been content to wait, and to let the interest stand, and to deal with the great frightened weak man, who was the duke as gently as one deals with a debtor one has resolved never to disgrace. And then Josiah Holloway had died. He had died in the autumn, quietly, of a failing heart, in the plain good house in the city where Eleanor had kept his books and read to him in the evenings and learned at his knee more of the law of debt and deed and obligation than most gentlemen learned in a lifetime. And he had left it all to her, for she was his only child, and he had loved her with the whole of his careful heart. And he had not the smallest illusion about the world she would be left to face without him. He had left her his fortune, which was considerable. He had left her his name, which the world would hold against her. And he had left her, last and gravest of all his bequests, the great brown leather portfolio with its papers within, the bond upon Ravensmere, signed and sealed and witnessed. The deed of mortgage by which the estate stood pledged in law, the long record of interest unpaid and principal untouched, and his own careful letters in his own careful hand, setting out exactly what was owed and exactly what, in the last extremity, the law of England would permit the holder of that bond to do. By that law cold, plain, faultless. No respecter of ravens or towers or rubies or ancient blood, Eleanor Holloway now held Ravensmere. Not in the loose way that a creditor holds a hope, she held the legal instrument itself, the deed and the bond together, and the debt was so long unpaid and so far beyond the family's means to clear that the security had ripened into something very near to ownership outright. She could, had she wished it, have foreclosed. She could have walked into that drawing-room any morning of that winter with a man of law at her shoulder and turned the whole proud family out into the frost-bright park, and the law would have stood behind her, silent and immovable, and there would have been nothing, not the dowager's will, nor the duke's title, nor the 2 centuries of polished pride that could have stayed her hand. And she had told no one. She had said nothing. She had let them seat her below the salt. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to misread her silence, and the family, to a soul, had misread it. They thought her cowed. They thought her grateful, a plain merchant's daughter clutching at the skirts of nobility, swallowing every insult for the sake of a coronet she had no right to hope for. They could not have been more wrong, for Eleanor's silence was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of dignity, and it had cost her more than any of them would ever know. For here was the shape of her heart, which not one person at that bright table had troubled to look for. When the marriage had first been proposed, for it had been the Duke's own doing, in his quiet desperation, a frightened man's scheme to bind the creditor's daughter into the family and so, he half hoped, soften the debt into a dowry and make the whole dreadful reckoning simply go away, Eleanor had not been deceived about any part of it. She had known they wanted her money, and not herself. She had known the dowager would despise her. She had read the arrangement as clearly as she read everything, with her clear grey eyes that did not look away. And she had come anyway. She had come not as a conqueror carrying a weapon, but as a woman carrying a hope. The small, stubborn, unfashionable hope that if she came honestly and bore herself well and gave them no cause, she might in time be met with kindness, that the marriage, loveless as it began, might grow into something a person could live a life inside, that a family might, against all the odds of pride, simply make room for her. She had brought the portfolio not to threaten, but because it was hers, and she did not leave such things lying about. And once inside that house, once she understood the full measure of their contempt, she had made a choice that a scheming woman would never have made, and that a weak one could never have held to. She had chosen to keep the advantage folded and silent. She had chosen not to wield the deed as a weapon, not to silence the dowager's cruelty by dropping the bond upon the dinner table, not to buy Alistair's courtesy with the threat of ruin. To do that, she felt, would have been to become the very thing they already believed her to be, a creature of commerce, buying her place with a debt held to her throat. She would rather be despised honestly than respected by force. And so she carried the whole great weight of it quietly, the knowledge that she held them all in the hollow of her hand, and she let them seat her below the salt, and she said nothing. Because dignity, real dignity, the dignity her father had taught her, was not a thing you announced. It was a thing you simply were, whether or not a single soul in the room could see it. But composure is not the same as numbness, and Eleanor felt every blade they laid against her. She felt them, and she set the memory of each one down, quietly, the way her father had taught her to set down a figure in a ledger, not in anger, but in record. There had been, that winter, no shortage of figures to set down. The Dowager and Lady Vespera between them had made an art of the small, staged humiliation, and they practiced it daily. There had been the morning the whole party rode out to a neighbouring house for a dinner of consequence, and Eleanor, dressed and waiting in the cold hall at the appointed hour, had been told with wide false surprise that surely she had had her invitation. And surely she had seen it lost, and the carriages had rolled away down the frosted drive without her, while Vespera's laugh trailed back like a ribbon on the air. There had been the gown, her best, the soft blue silk she had thought safe to wear at last to a music evening, sent down from her room freshly pressed by the Dowager's own maid, with a long iron-scorched seared brown across the breast of it, so that she must come down in her plain grey, or not come down at all, and the Dowager had remarked, sweetly before the assembled guests, how very wise dear Eleanor was to keep to colours that asked so little of a face. There had been the dinner at which Vespera had corrected, gently and publicly and quite wrongly, Eleanor's use of a fork, and the table had tittered, and Eleanor had thanked her gravely and gone on eating and given them nothing. She absorbed it all. She did not weep where they could see her, and she did not strike back, and she did not run. But each night she climbed the cold back stairs to the small plain room they had given her at the far unfashionable end of the house, and she lit her own single candle, for they did not waste the beeswax on her, and she sat at the little writing table by the window with the frost thickening on the glass. And she unlocked a small writing box of dark wood with a brass key she wore on a ribbon at her throat beneath her gown, and in that box lay her true country, the only square of the world that was wholly hers. There were her father's letters, soft now at the folds from much reading, his careful hand telling her again across the gulf of death to be patient, to be just, to keep her records and keep her temper and trust the slow sure working of the law. There was the great bond itself, and the deed of mortgage, the seals unbroken. There was a ledger, plainly bound, in which Eleanor kept her own quiet accounts, not of money only, but of all of it, the dates, the slights, the witnesses, the exact and unembroidered truth of each day in that house, set down in her even hand the way a careful banker records a transaction, so that if ever the day came when the truth must be told aloud, it would be told whole and provable and clean. She was not building a case for revenge. She told herself that, and it was true. She was simply, by long training and deep nature, a person who kept the record straight, because the record, kept straight, was a kind of dignity all its own, and dignity was the one possession they had not yet found a way to take from her. There was one soul in that house who saw her clearly, and his name was Thomas Caldwell. He was the family's man of business, the young solicitor who managed the Duke's affairs, a sober, plain-dressed, grave-eyed gentleman of 32 or 33, the son of a country attorney, a man who lived by his own careful work as Eleanor's father had lived by his, and who therefore stood, like her, a little below the salt of that proud world, near enough to serve it, and never near enough to be of it. He had been the only person at Ravensmere to treat her, from the first day, as though she were a person. He rose when she entered a room, though no one else troubled to. He spoke to her of sensible things in a plain, true voice. And he had, more than once that winter, let his quiet eyes rest upon her across the length of some glittering, cruel evening, with a look in them that was not pity — Eleanor would have borne anything before pity — but something graver and warmer, and more like respect, a recognition. The look of one steady soul finding another in a room full of glitter and noise. It was Thomas who, late one short grey afternoon when the others were out, found her alone in the cold library among the unread books, and stood a moment turning his hat in his careful hands, and then said to her, "Lo, what no one else in that house would have had the honesty to say." He told her plainly that she was being used and meant to be cast off. He had seen the family's accounts. He knew, better than anyone living save Eleanor herself, how desperately the Duke wanted money, and how the quarter-day approached, the dread day of reckoning when the great interest on the old debt fell due and could not, this year, be met. He told her the Dowager had been making inquiries, that there was talk, careful, quiet talk, of a richer bride for Alastair, an heiress out of the north with coal under her acres, and that the betrothal to Eleanor was to be broken the moment a better fortune could be secured, that she had been brought in as a stopgap and would be turned out as an embarrassment, and soon. He did not know quite what she carried, but he was a man who read documents for his living, and something in the dates, in the old bond he had glimpsed once in the Duke's own papers, in the very name Holloway, had begun to stir a suspicion in him that he hardly dared to shape. "I do not know all that you hold, Miss Holloway," he said at last, very quietly, his grave eyes on hers, "but I think you hold more than they know. And I think they mean to move against you before the quarter-day. I would not have you taken unawares." And Eleanor looked up at him, the one honest face in all that house, and felt something in her chest she had not let herself feel the whole long winter, and said only, steadily, that she thanked him, and that she was not, in the matter of the quarter-day, so unprepared as they supposed. Below the frost-laced window the short day was already dying, and somewhere above them in the warm bright part of the house the Dowager was even then deciding, with her cold and final certainty, that the merchant's plain daughter had been suffered under the Raven long enough, and that the time had come to put her out, before them all, for good. The day the Dowager chose for it was a day of high company, and she chose it for that very reason. There was to be a great gathering at Ravensmere that evening, not the close family alone, but the whole glittering county, the neighbouring lords and their ladies, the bishop, the Lord Lieutenant, a dozen titled cousins, and twice as many who hoped to be thought cousins, for the dowager understood. As she understood all the cold mathematics of consequence, that a humiliation is a private thing until it is witnessed, and a witnessed humiliation, performed before the right eyes, becomes a kind of law unto itself, a thing the world will not afterward let the victim undo. She would not whisper Eleanor out of the house by a side door in the grey of morning. She would put her out in the full blaze of the long gilded room, before the best blood in the county, so that the merchant's daughter should be marked for ever as a creature cast off, and so that no question could ever after be raised, in any drawing-room in England, of whether the Ravensmeres had used the girl ill. She would make the county her witness, and the county, she did not doubt, would take her side, because the county always took the side of the Raven and the Tower against the daughter of trade. So the candles were lit again, the great branches of them, and the frost stood again upon the tall windows, and the company came in their silks and their jewels, and filled the long room with the bright, hard noise of their voices, and Eleanor was sent for. She had known it would come. Thomas had told her it would come, and her own clear reading of the dowager's face that morning had told her the hour was near. She had dressed for it with great care, in the dove-grey, the plain, immaculate dove-grey they had so often mocked, and she had brushed her brown hair smooth and pinned it simply. And she had taken up from her room the worn brown leather portfolio that she had carried into that house upon the first day, and never once unfolded. And she had come down the cold back stairs with it upon her arm, and her writing-box beneath it. And her heart, she would say afterward, had been quieter in that hour than it had been the whole long winter. Because the hour of pretending was over at last, and there is a great peace in that, whatever waits on the other side. She came into the long room, and the bright noise of it dropped by a degree, the way a room changes when a thing it has been waiting for arrives. The dowager stood by the great hearth beneath the ducal arms, the Raven and the Tower carved in stone above her white head, and she was magnificent that night, in grey silk and the old diamonds, magnificent and cold and entirely certain of herself, for she had done this kind of thing before, in lesser ways all her long life, and it had never once failed her. Lady Vespera stood a little behind her, flushed and bright-eyed and lovely in rose-coloured satin, drinking it already, the triumph of it, before it had even begun. Alistair stood apart and uneasy near the window, not meeting Eleanor's eye, a weak young man who had wanted none of this and would lift no hand to stop it. The Duke sat in his great chair by the fire and looked into the flames and looked away from his own drawing-room, as he had looked away all winter, courteous and grey and silent, complicit in every cruelty he had not the courage to forbid. And along the walls, in the candlelight, the county stood and watched with the bright, pitiless curiosity of people who have been promised a spectacle. "Miss Holloway," the dowager said, and her voice carried the length of the room without her seeming to raise it at all. A cold, clear instrument she had played her whole life. "How good of you to come down. I had hoped to spare you this before so many, but you have left me, I fear. No gentler course." She let the silence work a moment, the long room hanging upon her. "It can be no secret to you that your presence among us was the fruit of a passing arrangement, entered into in a season of confusion, and that it has not answered, 'We are people of a certain blood and a certain standing, and there are obligations of name and of lineage that a person of your origin cannot, through no fault of your own, be expected to understand. The engagement between yourself and my nephew is at an end. It is broken this night, and broken finally, and the fortune and the future of this house shall be preserved, as is right, for a bride more worthy of the name it carries." You will be conveyed in the morning, with every courtesy, to wherever in the city your people are to be found." She smiled then, the cruelest stroke of all, gentle and terrible. "I am sure you have always known, my dear, that you did not belong beneath this roof." And the county breathed out, a soft collective sound, half a sigh and half a sentence, the sound of a verdict being enjoyed. Vespera's chin lifted. Somewhere a woman laughed, low, behind a fan. It was done. It had the shape of a thing done, and in any other winter, with any other woman standing in the dove grey at the foot of that bright room, it would have been the end. Eleanor did not flinch, and she did not weep, and she did not plead. She stood very still a moment in the candlelight, her grey eyes steady upon the dowager's face, and when she spoke her voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it was level, and it did not shake, and the room leaned in to hear it, because there was something in its very quietness that compelled the hearing. "Your Grace," she said, "I thank you for your courtesy. And before I am conveyed anywhere, there is a small matter of business that ought, I think, to be settled, for the sake of the house, and for the sake of the truth, which I have kept too long out of a foolish hope of kindness." And she crossed, unhurried, to the long polished table where the candles burned in their silver, and she set down upon it the worn brown leather portfolio, and she unfolded it, there before them all, for the first time in all the months she had borne it through that house. "Many years ago," she said, and her even voice went out into the listening room like a hand laid flat upon a troubled water, "in a season of confusion not unlike the one your Grace has named, this family borrowed a great sum of money upon the security of this estate. It borrowed against Ravensmere, against the house, the park, the home farm, the village, every acre and every stone. And it pledged the whole of it, in law, as surety for the debt. The bond was signed and sealed and witnessed. Here it is." She drew the great document from the leather and laid it open upon the table, the seals heavy upon it, and the candlelight caught the ink. "Here is the deed of mortgage, by which this estate stands pledged. Here is the record of the interest, 30 years of it, the most part unpaid." And here she laid down a folded letter, worn soft at the creases, is the hand of the man who lent that money and held that bond, and never once, in all those 30 years, pressed this family harshly, though the law would have let him strip it bare. His name was Josiah Holloway. He was a banker of the city. He was my father. And when he died, he left the bond, and the deed, and the debt, and the whole great weight of what is owed to me. The room had gone entirely silent. The bright, hard noise of it was gone as though it had never been. The candles burned, and the frost stood on the windows, and not a silk rustled. By the law of England, Eleanor went on, and still she did not raise her voice. The law that is no respecter of names or of blood. The debt has stood so long unpaid, and so far beyond this family's means to clear, that the security has ripened in my hand, very near to ownership outright. I hold the deed to Ravensmere. I have held it the whole of this winter. I held it at the foot of your table on the night of the betrothal feast, when this house raised its glasses and drank before me to the fortune of the family, to a fortune that is, by law, and has all this while been mine. She let that rest in the silence a moment, gently, without cruelty, and the dreadful symmetry of it went round the room like a cold draught. They had toasted their fortune. They had laughed at the plain bride below the salt, and the plain bride had held the deed to the very wine in their glasses. There was a man of law in that room, and Eleanor turned to him now. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "you manage this family's affairs. You know these papers, or papers very like them, for you have seen the bond once before in his Grace's own keeping. I would ask you, as an honest man, before honest witnesses, to look upon these and say whether they are what I have said they are. And Thomas Caldwell stepped forward out of the shadow at the edge of the bright room, grave and plain in his dark coat, and he took up the bond in his careful hands and read it, and the deed and the long record, and his face as he read them was the face of a man who has suspected a thing in the dark, and now sees it stand plain in the light. He laid them down at last and turned to the company, and he said, steadily, that the documents were genuine, that the seals were true and the witnessing in order, that the debt was as Miss Holloway had described it, of long standing and far beyond discharge, and that, by the law of England, the lawful title to Ravensmere, the very ground on which they stood, and the roof above their heads, was vested, beyond any question he could raise, in the lady in dove grey at the foot of the room. I am the family's man of business, he said quietly, and it is my plain duty to tell you that she speaks the simple truth. The estate is hers. Then the long room broke its silence, but not with the verdict the dowager had summoned it to give. There was a low murmur, a stirring along the candlelit walls, the bright, pitiless county turning all at once like a weathercock in a changed wind, and the faces that had leaned in to enjoy a humiliation looked now upon the woman who had been humiliated and found, to their astonishment, that they were looking up at her. Vespera's flush had drained to a chalk white, her scheme, the lost invitation. The scorched gown, the richer northern bride, the whole patient, cruel architecture of the winter lay in ruins about her satin slippers, and she put out one hand to the back of a chair as though the floor had moved. And the dowager stood beneath the Raven and the Tower, beneath the carved arms of 200 years of pride, and for the first and only time in her long imperious life the cold, clear certainty went out of her face. The diamonds rose and fell at her throat too quickly. Her lips parted and found nothing to say. She had drawn this room about her like a weapon, and the weapon had turned in her hand, and she looked, in that one terrible exposed instant, not magnificent at all, but old and frightened and small, defeated not by an answering cruelty, for Eleanor had offered her none, but by fact and by law, and by the unbearable self-possession of the woman she had despised. It was the Duke who moved. He rose from his great chair by the fire, slowly, a grey and heavy man, and he came forward into the middle of his own drawing-room, and the whole county watched him come. He stood a moment before Eleanor, and then, before the bishop and the Lord Lieutenant and every titled soul in the county, the Duke of Ravensmere bowed his head to the daughter of the city banker, and he spoke. And his voice was not the courteous, evasive murmur of all that long winter, but the voice of a man laying down a burden he had carried too long. "It is true," he said. "Every word of it is true, and I have known it true since the day her father died, and I have let this house treat its truest creditor as its meanest dependent. And I have looked into the fire so that I should not have to look at what I allowed. The debt is ours, the shame is ours. The cruelty done beneath this roof this winter was done in my house and with my silence, and the silence was the worst of it, for I am master here, and a master who looks away is a party to everything he will not see." He turned to the room, his head still bowed. "Miss Holloway holds the deed to Ravensmere by the law of England, and I shall not contest the law. I would not contest it if I could. A debt lent in honour is a debt owed in honour, and we have paid her honour back in contempt, and I have come, very late, to be ashamed." It was the costliest thing the proud, weak man had ever done, and in the doing of it something straightened in him that had been bent for 30 years, and he chose at the last his honour over his pride, and so began, in that bowed grey head, the slow redemption that the whole long winter had been waiting for. And then they all looked to Eleanor, the Duke and the Dowager and the white-faced rival and the whole turned county, to see what she would do with the power that lay, proven now and beyond any contesting, in the hollow of her steady hand. For she could end them. She could speak 3 words to Thomas Caldwell and turn the Raven and the Tower and the 2 centuries of pride out into the frost-bright park before the morning, and the law would stand silent and immovable behind her. And not a soul in England could have said she had not the right. The room knew it. The Dowager knew it best of all, and waited, rigid, for the stroke to fall. It did not fall. Eleanor gathered her father's letter gently back into its worn creases, and she looked round the silent room, and when she spoke at last it was without triumph and without revenge. In the same level voice with which she had borne every insult of that winter. "I did not come to this house to ruin it," she said. "I came hoping to be met with kindness, and I was not, and I kept what I held quiet all this while, not as a weapon, but because I would rather be despised honestly than respected by force. I will not put this family out of its home. The estate stands secure under my holding, and it shall remain your home, all of you, upon one condition, and one only, that the contempt which has filled these rooms be done, and that honesty and plain dignity take its place. I hold the deed. I shall not hold it over you. What you could not buy with cruelty, I give you freely, your home, and ask in return only the one thing your blood and your pride could never quite afford me, which is to be treated, beneath this roof, as a person." She turned then to Alistair by the window, gently, and released him from the loveless match with a few quiet, honourable words, freeing him as cleanly as she freed them all. And the Dowager, beneath the carved raven, met the grey, steady eyes of the woman she had seated below the salt, and found in them no gloating and no mercy asked for, and no cruelty returned, only an unbroken grace that she had no instrument in all her cold art to answer, and her defeat in that moment was quiet, and it was total, and it was complete. The county did not linger long after that, for there is nothing so swift to disperse as a crowd that has come for a spectacle and been given instead a lesson it had rather not learn about itself. The silks rustled toward the doors, the carriages were called for an hour before their time, and the bishop, who had a gift for landing always on the side that history would keep, paused as he went out to bow rather lower to the lady in dove grey than he had ever bowed to anyone beneath that roof, and to say, in a voice meant to be overheard, that he had not in 40 years witnessed a thing done with such Christian temperance, and that he hoped he might be permitted to call. And so the verdict the Dowager had summoned the county to pronounce against Eleanor was pronounced instead in her favour, and carried out into the frost upon 100 wagging tongues, and by the breakfast hour of the following day there was not a drawing-room within 30 miles in which the daughter of Josiah Holloway was not spoken of with a careful and slightly frightened respect, which is the only kind of respect that such company has ever truly had to give. The mornings that followed were quiet ones, and Eleanor governed them quietly. There was no upheaval at Ravensmere, no turning out of old servants, nor stripping of old rooms, none of the loud reordering by which a conqueror announces a conquest. The change came rather as the thaw comes, by degrees and almost without sound, so that one scarcely marked the hour of it, but only saw, afterward, that the ice was gone. she sat down with Thomas Caldwell over the long-neglected ledgers, the two of them at the great table where the betrothal candles had once burned, and they went through the whole tangled history of the estate's debts as one might go through a sick room, gravely and without blame, setting each thing in its place. The unpaid interest of 30 years she did not call in. She struck the most of it away with a stroke of her father's own pen, saying only that her father had never pressed this house, and she would not begin by pressing it in his name. The bond she did not cancel, for the bond was the truth, and she would not pretend a truth away, but she set the estate upon a new and honest footing beneath her holding, the rents ordered, the home farm mended, the village roofs that had gone 3 winters unrepaired put right before the next snow, so that the deed which the family had so dreaded became, in her keeping, the very instrument of the estate's recovery. What pride had let fall to ruin, mercy quietly raised. The Duke she dealt with as one deals with a man who has begun, late and painfully, to mend. He came to her of his own accord on the second morning, grey and humbled, and asked, not as a duke asks, but as a man asks, whether she would suffer him to set the affairs of the house in honest order under her hand, and to learn from her steward the plain arithmetic he had spent his life too proud to look at. And she suffered it gladly, and more than suffered it, she gave him back. In the giving of that small trust, some portion of the dignity he had bowed away before the county, for she understood, as the cruel never do, that a man redeemed is worth 100 men ruined, and that to lift a fallen pride gently is a finer victory than to grind it down. The Duke and the daughter of trade were seen often after that walking the long gallery together of an afternoon. The old man's grey head bent to hear her, and the household that had taken its temper from his silence took its temper now from his slow visible turning, and grew kinder by the week. He had looked away all winter, he looked now directly at what he had allowed, and the looking made him, at the very end of his life, a better master than he had been at the beginning of it. And that was Eleanor's doing, though she never once claimed it, and would have been astonished to be thanked. The dowager was another matter, and Eleanor handled it with a delicacy that those who watched her never forgot. A lesser victor would have driven the old woman out, or kept her on as a daily exhibit of defeat, seated her below the salt, and let the county come to look. Eleanor did neither. She went to the dowager's apartments herself, alone, and what passed between the two women behind that door no third soul ever heard, but it was understood afterward that the dowager had been offered, in plain terms and without witnesses to make the offering bitter, a choice. She might remain at Ravensmere, in rooms befitting her years and her name, upon the single understanding that the contempt was finished, or she might retire, if she preferred her pride to her comfort, to the dower house at the edge of the park, with a settled income honourably paid, and live there as private as she wished. There was no humiliation in either course, because Eleanor had taken the humiliation out of both of them, and that was the cruelest mercy of all to a woman who had lived by humiliation as by bread, for it left her nothing to be a martyr to. She chose the dower house. She went there within the fortnight, chastened and upright, her diamonds still at her throat and her back still straight. Defeated past any disguising, but not destroyed, not paraded, not broken. Granted by the very woman she had despised the one thing her own cold creed had never granted anyone, which was a defeat with the dignity left in it. And if, in the long evenings at the dower house, the old woman ever came to understand that she had been beaten not by a sharper cruelty than her own, but by the entire absence of cruelty, by a largeness of spirit she had no measure for, then perhaps that understanding was the beginning of something in her too, But that is a longer story than this one, and Eleanor, who had planted it, was content to leave it to grow, or not as it would. As for Lady Vespera, she did not wait to be dealt with at all. The field she had schemed so long to win was lost to her past, all recovering the moment the deed lay open upon the table, and she had the wit, at least to know it. The richer northern bride she had meant to fetch for Alastair was never spoken of again, and the lost invitation and the scorched gown and the whole patient cruel architecture of her winter were swept off in a single morning like cobwebs from a swept room. She made her farewells with a brittle bright composure that fooled no one, kissed the air beside Eleanor's cheek with lips gone white, and was gone in her carriage before the week was out, off to some other great house and some other cousin's match, to begin the only labour she had ever learned, which was the labour of getting by beauty and scheming what she had not the character to earn. She exits our story there, on the gravel sweep in the cold sunlight, lovely and empty-handed, and we need not follow her, for she carried nothing away from Ravensmere that was worth the carrying, and left behind her nothing that anyone would mourn. And so the house was set in order, and the winter that had been so long and so cruel came at last to its breaking, and one looked up one morning and found the frost gone from the tall windows and a thin gold sun lying along the floor of the long gallery, and the snow shrinking on the park, and the rooks loud and busy in the bare trees above the avenue. With the order came peace, and with the peace came the one thing that the whole tangled winter had quietly been making room for, though Eleanor herself had scarcely dared to name it even in the privacy of her own steady heart. For the arranged match was honourably dissolved, and Alastair, released and visibly lightened, had gone gratefully off to the friends and the freedom he had always wanted, and that meant that the only barrier of name and circumstance that had stood between Eleanor Holloway and the grave young man of business who had treated her, alone in all that house, with unfailing respect, that barrier was simply gone, fallen, away with the rest of the winter's ice. And there was this further thing, the finest thing of all, that whatever now grew between them grew clean, for the deed was no longer a secret she carried, nor a weapon anyone might wield, but a settled and known fact, and Thomas Caldwell had loved her plainly and patiently on the night when she had nothing at all in the eyes of the world, when she sat below the salt in her mocked grey gown, with not one soul in that bright room to take her part but him. He had honoured her when honouring her cost him something and gained him nothing. He had warned her, asked nothing, watched over her papers and her dignity through the whole long dark of it, and so when he came to her at last, there could be no question on either side of fortune or advantage, for he had chosen her at her lowest, and she had marked it and kept it. The way she kept all the things that mattered, quietly and for good. He came to her on a bright, cold afternoon in the early thaw, and they walked out together into the frost-bright grounds, where the snow lay still in the blue shadows of the yews, but had melted to a sparkle on the open lawns, and their breath went up white before them. And for a long while they spoke only of the estate and the ledgers and the village roofs, as two careful people will speak of safe things when the unsafe thing is too large and too dear to be approached all at once. But at the turn of the long walk, where the bare limes opened upon the prospect of the whole house lying golden in the low sun, Thomas Caldwell stopped and turned to her and laid down his carefulness as she had once laid down her portfolio, all at once and for good. He told her that he had loved her since the night of the feast, when she had answered cruelty with that quiet, unbroken voice, and he had known, watching her, that he was in the presence of the truest gentlewoman he should ever meet, name or no name, face or no face. He told her he had nothing to offer her that she did not already hold in greater measure herself. No fortune, no rank, only an honest heart and an honest profession and a plain man's steady devotion, and that he would not have dared to speak at all while she was poor and friendless, lest she think he sought her need, nor would he easily have dared to speak now that she was great, lest the world think he sought her wealth, but that he had found he could not, in the end, keep silent and call himself honest, and so he asked her simply, with his hat in his hand and his heart in his plain face, whether she might consent to be loved by a man who wanted nothing of hers but herself. And Eleanor Holloway, who had not wept when the whole county was summoned to shame her, found her clear grey eyes were not quite steady now, and she put her hand in his, there in the cold gold light, with the house she owned lying gentle below them, and she gave him his answer. "I have been valued all my life for what I might be worth to someone," she said, and weighed below the salt for the smallness of my name and the plainness of my face. And I had near given up the hope of being wanted for nothing but myself. You wanted me when I was worth nothing. That is the only fortune I ever cared to be married for. And she told him what she had come in that long winter to know past any unknowing, that worth was never in a face, nor in a name, nor in the bright noise a proud family makes over its wine, that it lay in what a person quietly keeps, and how honourably they use it when the using is in their power, that she had carried the deed to a great estate through months of contempt and never once struck with it, and that this, the keeping and the not striking, was the whole of what she understood by dignity, and was a thing no one could seat below the salt. Because it does not sit at the table at all, but stands, always, a little above it. "I was never below the salt," she said, gently, more to the winter behind her than to the man before her. "I only let them think so a while, because I had not yet decided to let them see." They were married in the spring, without great show, in the small grey church at the edge of the village whose roof her money had mended, and the Duke himself gave her away with a steadiness in his bowed grey head that the parish remarked upon for years, and even the dowager came down from the dower house for the day, upright and silent, and not, it was noticed, entirely cold about the eyes. And in the autumn that followed there was a gathering again in the long gilded drawing-room at Ravensmere, the beeswax tapers lit in their great silver branches, and the firelight warm on the carved raven and tower above the hearth. But it was a different room now, the same room made over. The cruelty gone out of it as the frost goes out of a thawed pane. And the candlelight that had once shone down on mockery shone now on plain kind faces glad to be there. And when the glasses were filled and the company rose, it was the old Duke who rose first, slow and grave and proud at last of a thing worth being proud of, and he lifted his glass not to the fortune of the house, as that house had once so emptily done, but to the mistress of it, and the whole warm room rose with him, and turned to the quiet woman in grey at the head of the long table. The plain bride they had seated below the salt, who had held the deed to it all and held her peace, and given them back their home, and been raised by nothing but her own unbroken dignity from the foot of the table to the head of it, and they drank to her, sincerely, every one, this time. And the toast that was raised that night in the candlelit drawing-room at Ravensmere was a true one. And it was raised to Eleanor, by law and by love, and by her own quiet honour the mistress of the house, and she received it as she had received everything, gravely and gently, and with her steady grey eyes shining, and the fire burned warm on the old stone arms above her, and the long winter was over, and she was home.